Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today I'm talking about a visitor to my channel who came to castigate me for my inappropriate behavior. You see, this video is actually a sequel to one where I discuss why it is impossible to talk to militant atheists, and to illustrate that point, I mentioned three different militant atheists whom I had recently spoken to, all on the same channel. The channel was a Christian channel, which they had descended upon because some other atheist presenter had brought to their attention that this vile Christian had dared to make apologetics videos and obviously was irrational and needed to be put to his place, so they all flocked to it, as they always do, because, let's face it, the lone wolf, free-thinking, individual atheists always hunt in packs. They never travel alone. Or at least seldom do. But therein lies the point. The person who visited my channel actually attacked me on the basis that I took conversations that I had had with atheists on the tube of you and made a video about them and how that was petty of me. I found that rather bemusing, since if you had actually listened to the three other videos that I had made, I didn't mention anyone's names, just their generic arguments. And if you know anything about the self-declared skeptic community, you know that you can't really trace people through the arguments they make and the words they use, because they all talk exactly alike. You really can't tell the difference between one militant atheist poster and another militant atheist poster. They all talk in the same cadence, they all speak in the same way, they use the same words, they repeat the same slogans. And that's one of the main points that I was illustrating. Because as much as the self-declared skeptic community claims that it is a collection of free thinkers coming up with their own ideas and their own thoughts and beliefs, the reality has always been that it's a large echo chamber, and they're repeating pre-scripted lines. The atheist community is not known for its creativity or its broadness. Virtually every single one you speak to will repeat exactly the same arguments in exactly the same way, using exactly the same terminology, often word for word quoting some other atheist. Which is one of the reasons that you really can't talk to militant atheists, because they won't look past their indoctrination, which is weird because they keep complaining about religion because of it being all about indoctrination. And to them, indoctrination means brainwashing. And they like to see themselves as having been freed of the brainwashing of religion and embracing the light of reason, with each one becoming this unique individual with much more to contribute than they ever could have had when they were religious, because when they were religious, they were being told what to think, and they weren't allowed to have their own opinions, but now they are, and there's this grand republic of thought with individuals coming up with brand new ways of seeing things, which enriches us all within the skeptic community. And you don't really see that in practice. In practice, you keep seeing the same old quotes over and over and over again. But therein lies the point. You see, I made a video, and again, it was really three videos, but I generally think of it as just one video. And the reason is because it's all about the same subject, and I would have only made one if I could trust it to go through. Though, to be fair, I do include some material in one video that I won't include in another, just in case. It's precautionary. It also helps me track what might be problematic, according to the Tube of You and Al Gore and his rhythm. But having said all that, the atheist community thrives on depicting religion and religious people in negative light and casting itself in a positive light, usually within the framework of the war between science and religion, where atheists speak for reason, science, and free thought, whilst religion speaks for enslaved thinking and faith-based beliefs that aren't based on any reason or evidence at all. And a large part of that is what will be discussed in this video, where religious people largely think with their emotions and what makes them feel good and needing to validate their emotions, as opposed to atheists who think logically and rationally. And it has been my experience that the atheists of the self-declared skeptic community are guilty of everything they accuse religious people of doing. Indeed, I would point out that their own beliefs are a form of religion, that modern secularism is itself a religion. Of course, in reply to that, they would simply mock me for not knowing the definition of the word secular. Secular means not religious. And they miss the point when they say that, because I really don't care how the dictionary defines certain words when I'm talking about how they're used in the real world and what real people are like. But they seem to cling ardently to dictionary definitions, which is very ironic when you think about it, because they'll also often accuse the religious people they're talking to of committing the dictionary definition fallacy, where you only accept one definition of a word as valid. Indeed, that was one of the things I was accused of by one of the atheists I was speaking to previously, before the one came to my channel to castigate me. And on the one hand, they will complain that religious people never define their words, so you can't understand what their arguments are, and that's because their arguments are vapid and shallow, and they keep them as vague as possible so they don't have to defend anything, because apologetics is nothing more than presenting what might sound reasonable in order to keep people in religion, but has no validity to it intellectually. And religious people will make these vague pronouncements and not define their terms, but the minute you do define your terms, they then try and counter your argument using a different definition than the one you explicitly used and explicitly told them you're using. And if you tell them that they're using the wrong definition, you're committing the argument ad dictionarium logical fallacy, where you assume that there's only one valid definition to the word. And it's fairly obvious when you're talking to one of these types of atheists. The sort that actually runs gaggle, by the way. That's why I have to sometimes talk in a kind of odd, cartoonish voice, and why some of my word choices are so odd. Not as odd as they were toward my exile. And by the way, I'm going to be bringing up my exile quite often in this video. There is a method to my madness. Please bear with me. But before my exile, I got really bad at this, and it was mostly to ensure that my videos could go through, sliding under the intelligence synthetica radar. But mine is performative, precisely because, if I slur my speech a little, And precisely because if I speak in such an odd way, I'm helping to evade certain adverse consequences that would occur should I speak like a normal person. Hopefully, when I get my new channel, I shall be able to speak not entirely normally like I would in real life, but more so. But for here, it shall be the elaborate and overly performative narratives. But having said all that, the person who saw my videos came to my channel and objected to what I did. Because apparently I was being petty and I was driven by resentment because I was talking about atheists in a negative way. This proves that I'm being emotional and I'm not thinking rationally about the topics. I find this rather ironic, though, because I checked said person's own TubeOU channel, and it turns out that this person makes atheist YouTube videos which are entirely focused on debunking religion and pointing out the fallacies of religious people's arguments and thinking. You see, I find that interesting because even though I have made videos about atheists, and this video itself is a video about atheists, most of the content on my channel is not about atheists. A lot of it is, and a lot of it recently is, going back to even before my exile. But I do talk about other topics besides just atheism. And yet I'm motivated by my resentment because I criticize atheists. But this other person makes arguments about how religion is false, it's not based on reason, religious people are irrational. And I bet if I were to tell said person that he is arguing based on resentment and emotion, he wouldn't like it very much, would he? Of course not. I'm supposed to see the atheist as logical and rational, and not simply doing things because they're motivated by their feelings and needing to be validated. And yet every single video on this person's channel is a video that talks about religion and how religion is wrong and how religious people are flawed in their thinking and how religion is this dangerous, toxic thing. The real reason I speak about atheists, there are actually two reasons. The first is I find it psychologically fascinating and sociologically fascinating. Because the atheist movement, by defining atheism as a mere lack of belief in a God and insisting that they are a great big nothing burger that you can't criticize because there's nothing to criticize, has allowed all of the things that you see within any given human movement to grow unchecked because it's never examined. And as such, all of the negative impulses that usually cause problems in human society, that cause divisions within movements, all of those were able to grow large because atheists cannot criticize their own beliefs. They insist they have no beliefs to criticize. They just lack belief in gods and the supernatural due to insufficient evidence. And this allows the atheist movement to actually ignore problems within their community while at the same time allowing those problems to grow large. For example, one of the most common things you will hear from atheists as they criticize religion is that religious beliefs and religious arguments are all rooted in logical fallacies, while at the same time presenting the atheist as the voice of reason, giving us logic and evidence. But they will not analyze any of the actual beliefs that the atheist movement promotes, because they must insist there is no atheist movement. It's just people who lack belief in a God, nothing more, with nothing else in common with themselves but a lack of belief. They actually say that quite often, that atheists have nothing in common with other atheists but their lack of belief in a God. But these are the same people who listen to atheist YouTube channels, who read atheist blogs if they still read blogs, who visit atheist websites, should they still do that, who would read atheist books if they're inclined to reading books, who listen to atheist podcasters, and who support atheist organizations like the American Humanist Association, the Center for Inquiry, Humanist International, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the National Secular Society, the British Humanist Association, Recovering from Religion, the Secular Student Alliance, so on. The fact that they listen to other popular atheists and they have a hierarchical system within organizations that obviously promote atheism, and that those organizations clearly promote a humanist view of the world, and even people like Alex O'Connor or Drew McCoy, who once embraced humanism but now reject humanism because they value animal life equally to human life, they're still nevertheless drawing from the humanist tradition and humanist beliefs to the point where they're really not distinguishable from them. And simply saying, I used to be humanist but I'm not now, doesn't automatically make you a blank slate. It's obvious that whether they want to admit it or not, even people like Alex O'Connor, who are not humanists because they value animal life equally to human life, are in fact secular humanists. They have all the same beliefs that secular humanists have, and they promote humanism and the humanist ethos. They may prefer to call themselves secularists now, because humanism is too exclusive to humanity, but there is no material objective difference between secularism as they conceptualize it being, and I don't just mean separation of religion and government, I mean being a secular rather than religious person. There is no difference between the secular values and beliefs they hold to as secularists and humanism, other than the term humanism being applied. And that's what most modern-day atheists actually are. They're just people following the humanist traditions. And if you want to understand what they believe, read the Humanist Manifestos. And I mean all of them. I know we're supposed to play along where when a new Humanist Manifesto is written and accepted, the old ones are simply done away with and the new one is the only one binding. But as with any movement, beliefs and practices don't go away that easily, and really the older humanist literature still inspires the new atheist thinking, so that's why you'll still see ideas within the Humanist Manifestos that are supposedly superseded still showing up in their arguments. For example, there is a large push within modern world to promote assisted which the advocates of it call death with dignity. Well, the term death with dignity originates from the humanist tradition, and it is found in the 1973 Second Humanist Manifesto. And the reason it's now entering the halls of government is because people who grew up in the new atheist era may know that the new atheism had its flaws, but they still have this understanding of religion being this dangerous thing that needs to be kept in check, and how we need to live in a secular society with secular values, and part of that would be allowing death with dignity. In other words, they have a specific value and belief system that they are imposing on everyone else, with the justification being that it's not religion, it's secular. But it really is a form of religion, whether or not they like to admit it. And pretending that we must understand religion as belief in gods and the supernatural really ignores the fact that the reason we find it so wrong to impose religion on other people is because you're telling them what they must believe and what values to hold. And if they don't really hold them, you're forcing them to do things that go against what they believe. This new divide between secular values and religious values ignores that and pretends that the reason it is wrong to impose religious beliefs on people isn't because it's wrong to impose beliefs on people. It's wrong to impose only religious beliefs, and that's because religious beliefs are irrational and dangerous and lead to tyranny, whilst secularism leads to democracy and freedom. But secular values don't lead to democracy and freedom. They simply lead to imposing a certain specific view of the world on everyone else. And that's exactly why I'm critical of it. But they blind themselves to this by using wordplay and sophistry. And that brings up the problem with the visitor to my channel. One of the main objections that I have to talking to militant atheists is that they will not actually listen to what it is that you're saying. And the visitor to my channel actually claimed that me saying that proved that my thinking was emotional and not rational. And the real problems I had is because my arguments really were based on logical fallacies. I really was relying on special pleading and false and on equivocation and other bog standard apologetics that are just not rational. Was I, though? I'm not an apologist. I know in the eyes of the atheist community, I am an apologist. But you have to remember that there are two types of apologists, and I am not either. The first sort is what they really are, and it's the definition that you will hear from the atheist community, and which they will apply so strictly that, indeed, I am an apologist. But it becomes a meaningless distinction by doing so. And that is, an apologist is someone who defends the Christian faith. At least in the context of when they attack Christianity, because when the atheist community attacks religion, it's almost always just Christianity they're attacking. And it's not because it's the most popular religion where they live. It's because the modern atheist movement is not a group of people who just lack belief in a god. They largely came out of the progressive movement of the 19th century. I've discussed that before, and I'll discuss it in other videos. I don't want to bog this one down too much, but there's a reason why the modern atheist community is the way it is. But having said that, an apologist is someone within the context of Christianity who defends the Christian faith from criticism and attack. And to that degree, yes, I'm an apologist, since I will defend Christianity from criticism and attack. The reason I say I'm not an apologist is because in the real world, when we call someone an apologist, we genuinely mean someone who is either formally doing this for a living or, at the very least, does it as a main focus of their behavior. And even people who don't work in an official capacity or even in a semi or quasi-official capacity as an apologist running an apologetics ministry. They're people whose primary interest is only in defending the Christian faith and nothing else. My interest is in philosophy and in psychology. And the reason I defend Christianity is both because I think it is true, although I am open to hearing criticisms of it, quite contrary to how the atheist community presents me. And because quite often the criticisms leveled against it are just unfair. They misrepresent what Christians believe, what the theology actually says, what the Bible really says, and of course the history of Christianity. They'll just misrepresent everything. And even if I weren't a Christian, I would defend Christianity on the grounds that their arguments are invalid. I know I would do that because even though in their eyes I'm a Christian apologist who thinks I have the one true religion, TM, and all other religions are just false and fairy tales, making me a hypocrite since I refuse to subject my religion to the same scrutiny I do with other religions, which is of course something they just assume. The reality about me is that I have actually defended other religions. I have quite often defended Islam from false claims. I don't do that as much as I used to. Relative to how much output I put, I don't do anything as much as I used to, but relative to the output, because it was really popular to attack Islam after 9/11. And it's become less so over time. But both the left and the right were just hammering Islam, and quite often what they were saying about Islam wasn't true, and it was unfair, and it's unfair to all the Muslims who have nothing to do with the terrorism. I defended Islam. Not because I'm Muslim, but because it was the right thing to do, to accurately understand the faith, rather than just criticize it based on hysteria. And I will clarify or defend Hinduism or Buddhism or Taoism if I think that they are being unfairly maligned. I would even defend Wicca or neo-paganism if it was being unfairly maligned. That's not to say that if I heard someone make a statement that was false about a religion, I would necessarily know it's false, because even though I have a degree in religious studies and I know a great deal about religion, I don't know everything, and especially if the religion is more obscure, it might pass by. But on the whole, I try and be fair with everyone's belief systems, even secularism. The main problem with secularism, though, is that it is parasitic. It relies on the existence of Christianity to even exist. And even though the early humanists or the early secularists actually acknowledged that fact and saw secularism as an evolutionary growth away from Christianity that still took the core parts of Christianity as truth, but moved away from the unnecessary belief in the supernatural. I'll go into greater detail about that history in another video as well. Perhaps on my new channel, perhaps here, I don't know. The modern secular movement pretends that secularism has nothing to do with Christianity, and that the humanist tradition actually predates Christianity, going back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that if any plagiarism happened at all, it happened the other way, with Christians plagiarizing any good idea that it had from humanism. Basically saying if anything at all is good about Christianity, that good was not really Christian, it's actually secular humanist, and they stole it. And of course, gave us an inferior knockoff copy of it, because Christianity corrupts everything, and that the true humanist version of it would be great. This is the version of history you get from A.C. Grayling, it's the version you get from Tim Whitmarsh, and it's the version you see quite often in the atheist videos. I think Darkmatter2525 did a video about where he mentioned that sort of thing as well. It was his documentary on how Christianity destroys art and everything else, and it was nonsense, but that's what he did. Dark Matter's video was actually about Christian values and how they say you should recover them, and how Christianity actually into the Dark Ages. I can't remember the name of the video off the top of my head, though, so we'll have to go with it. His source, of course, was A.C. Grayling, so it's really just A.C. Grayling. But that's the whole point. the reality of what's being argued within the atheist community in the modern world is that it is largely and ironically a delusion. They have a false understanding of history, a false understanding of how history unfolds, almost like it's this manifest destiny leading us to a progressive future where religion has died, reason has prevailed, and science has given us a utopia. And they don't understand the nuances of human behavior or what could cause things. They don't realize that atheists themselves will have fundamental differences in the same way, and it won't work the way Christopher Hitchens said, where no matter how entrenched someone is in their beliefs, if they're an atheist, they're willing to listen and hear out the other side and perhaps change their mind, whilst religion prevents that by making every single issue a divine mandate that they won't listen to any alternative to because you're committing blasphemy if you go against it. That's not really the reality that we live in. Quite often the atheists are the ones that are way less willing to listen than the Christians are. And they don't really understand the historical realities of things like the European wars of religion, which were not simply fought because one group was Catholic, another group was Protestant, and they hated each other and they fought. There was more to it than that. And they don't really seem to understand that the secular alternatives to religion that they're giving us would have the same inherent problems, and that people are perfectly willing to kill each other over secular, not religious ideologies and beliefs. And therein lies the point. They absolutely refuse to accept that they even have anything to criticize, that they even have anything to examine. They just lack belief. And then they promote specific beliefs behind this veil of lack of belief, including the belief that no gods exist, because that's what atheism really is. Atheism is the denial of the existence of God. It is not just a lack of belief in a God. And it's obvious if you talk to them that they're going to deny God exists. They're going to compare God to Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. They're going to tell you that God is just pretend. They even wrote children's books that are titled that. You have Dan Barker who wrote children's books that say, God is just pretend. And I'm supposed to see that book and think he's not telling children that God doesn't exist. He just lacks belief. Really? I mean, when they call God a fictional character or mythology, or go about saying the God character in the Bible or the Jesus character in the Bible, I'm supposed to hear them merely lacking belief? Am I really supposed to hear that it's tragic that as an adult I still have an imaginary friend in reference to God, and then outright say that God is imaginary and that humans invent gods, and see the person saying that as someone who's not claiming God doesn't exist? They just lack belief. I've even had an atheist outright say God does not exist, and yet the atheist does not incur the burden of proof when he says God doesn't exist, because atheism, by definition, is a lack of belief in a God. It's silly. And yet none of them address this. At best, you're going to get some of them saying, "You're confused. You don't know the difference between strong and weak atheism," and then giving you that stupid lecture that I've heard a million times. The thing is, I know that as a typical religious person, I was told by my pastor at church never to talk to atheists, and every atheist I talk to is the very first atheist I've ever spoken to, and I have no idea what they're going to say. But I guarantee you, if you're an atheist listening to this, I've spoken to other atheists. I know the difference between strong and weak atheism. I know that some atheists differ than others. What you don't understand is I don't care about those distinctions. Those distinctions came from the atheist community explaining itself in a way that fits their own narrative, which sometimes has to be revised when it crashes too hard into reality. But when it is revised, it's just a salvage operation where they're trying to preserve the core of atheism being just a lack of belief and them not having to prove anything. And it's obvious that the atheists do have something to prove. The idea that a debate between a Christian and an atheist is a debate between a Christian who claims a God, his specific Christian God, Yahweh, exists, and that it's not other gods like Allah or Buddha or Krishna, and that Christian is making all sorts of claims about his God, and he alone has the sole burden of proof, while all the atheist is doing is asking for evidence. It means nothing when the atheist comes to the Christian and starts mocking and ridiculing them, and calling God not just non-existent, but also evil and unworthy of our worship, even if he exists. And the idea that atheists have no burden of proof is just cowardice. And I can't see it any other way, because that's what it obviously is, and it's what's right in front of me. And the fact that atheists keep telling me that I'm confused and I don't know the difference between strong and weak atheism, it doesn't mean anything to me anymore. I don't care that atheists think that because I'm religious, I'm stupid and I'm uninformed and I'm uneducated. I have heard these arguments before, and I have enough intelligence to understand them. I'm just rejecting them. And let's face reality. All of the accusations about how I'm emotional, they don't mean anything. The idea that I'm thinking emotionally and not evidentially means nothing when it's coming from someone who merely lacks belief in a God and has no burden of proof, who is also calling me delusional for believing in a magical sky wizard. If an atheist wants to be taken seriously by me, then they have to accept that atheism is in fact a belief that gods don't exist, that atheists are making the claim that God doesn't exist, and that atheists have the burden of proof for their claim that God does not exist. Of course, saying that gets you treated to the dogmatic recital of another slogan, and that would be that theists are dishonest and they're shifting the burden of proof. And that's not true either. I'm not being dishonest and I'm not shifting the burden of proof. Shifting the burden of proof would be if I said, God exists, but I don't have to prove God exists. The burden of proof is on you to prove me wrong. But that's not what I'm saying. I fully accept that theists have the burden of proof to show that God exists. I just don't accept that the sole burden of proof lies with the theist. The atheist is claiming that God does not exist and also has the burden of proof. I have to emphasize the word also. I'm not saying the sole burden of proof is on the atheist to prove God doesn't exist. But I am saying that atheists equally have the burden of proof. And that's how it was historically understood until Anthony Flew redefined atheism in the 1970s. Which is ironic because atheists will often criticize religious people because religious people will redefine words and how dishonest that is. But Anthony Flew just flagrantly redefined atheism from a belief there is no God to a lack of belief in a God, explicitly for the purpose of getting out of the burden of proof. He even said that was the reason for doing so in the presumption of atheism, and they get away with it. Of course, now modern atheists just not truth tell and say that Anthony Flew didn't really redefine atheism, that atheism has always been defined as a lack of belief in a God, and anyone who says that atheism is a belief there is no God is operating under theist bias, but atheists have always understood atheism as a mere lack of belief. And that's rubbish. They haven't. And they usually start with the A means without, or lack of, and theism means belief in a God. And you put those together, you get without belief in a God, or lack of belief in a God. And they don't really seem to understand that A in Greek indicates a negation. It doesn't necessarily mean lack of. And even in our modern language, it doesn't mean lack of all the time. If I tell you that something is atypical, I am not saying it's lacking in typical. And that's the point. A means not. It does not mean lack of. And of course, now they have these quotes from Charles Bradlaugh and Bertrand Russell and Robert Ingersoll that they'll trot out and they'll say, see, these historical atheists defined atheism as a lack of belief in a God. It proves it's not Anthony Flew. And they don't seem to understand that the earliest such quote, at least that I've seen, goes only back to the 19th century. So even if you accept what they're saying, that would only prove that atheism, being defined as a lack of belief in a God, would only go back to the 19th century. But it doesn't really matter, because the earliest quote they have, I believe, is Charles Bradlaugh. I might be mistaken. Ingersoll's quote may have been before Bradlaugh. They were contemporaries. But I believe the earliest one was Charles Bradlaugh. And I happen to own a copy of his theological essays. And I actually know exactly what Bradlaugh was saying in this quote. I don't have my copy of the theological essays right in front of me. And I'm not going to give you word for word the quote as a result. But atheists would like to point out that Charles Bradlaugh, in one of his theological essays, said that he doesn't even know what the word God means. And they take that quote, and they say this proves that Charles Bradlaugh defined atheism as a mere lack of belief in a God. He lacks belief. He doesn't even understand what the word God means because he has no idea of God in his head. He lacks belief. The only problem with that is that nothing in the actual quote has Bradlaugh saying, I lack belief. And there's more than one way to understand the individual sentence. Sure, you could take his quote and understand it that he has no idea of what the word God means because he lacks belief in a God. But he could be saying something else entirely, like that the word is just meaningless to him because he doesn't think the thing exists, which happens to actually be closer to what he was actually saying if you read the essay. Because if you read the theological essay, Bradlaugh's actual point was that the idea of God is incoherent and ill-defined, and when you speak to even the most learned of clergy, they cannot explain exactly what God is. And because they cannot pinpoint exactly what God is, and because there are so many opinions about God and what God is and what God means, the word God becomes meaningless. And it's obvious that it's describing a non-existent abstraction rather than talking about a concrete reality. Bradlaugh's actual argument was that if God existed, then we would agree on what God is and everyone would say the same things. But because we speak of God in vague, general terms, and there's so much confusion about it, it's obvious that the word God is meaningless because God doesn't really exist. Instead of Bradlaugh's quote proving that atheism has always been defined as a lack of belief in a God because Bradlaugh himself lacked belief, it's actually the opposite. It's him arguing that God does not exist. And therein lies the point. The modern atheist community doesn't read its own sacred scriptures, which is what this sort of literature has become. It's where they get all their arguments from. And like a lot of Pentecostals or evangelicals, they'll often take isolated verses and read them in a thoroughly modern context and read into them certain things. I remember David Barton does this a lot when he talks about how the founding fathers were inspired by the Bible. And don't get me wrong, Barton does have a valid point that modern day secular academia, especially in the atheist sense, the militant atheist variety, will often downplay or deny Christian influences that obviously existed historically. But Bradlaugh goes too far and tries to attach too much meaning to too few things whilst promoting historical myths himself. One of them that gets often repeated, and which I heard Jack Hibbs repeat, I actually made a video about this, is that America's founding fathers, after freeing us from the tyranny of a king who claims to rule by divine right, knew that their new government in order to be free, couldn't just entrust all the power to one man like Britain had been under the king. But they didn't exactly know what to do, so they turned to their Bible and they read a verse from Isaiah, which said that God is our king, God is our lawgiver, God is our judge. And from there they understood that there should be three branches of government with power separated between those three branches. Thus, America's founding fathers created the only republic that existed in the world at the time, and the only government that separated powers into three branches, coming up with this concept of separation of powers, and it was all based on the Bible. And of course, this is a historical myth that helps intertwine Christianity with American values, and it's complete rubbish. The idea of the three branches of government actually existed in British law. King George III did not rule by the divine right of kings, which itself is a concept most modern people, especially modern Americans, don't understand. The divine right of kings was a French jurist theory that actually came from the early modern period, not the medieval period, for example. A lot of people think medieval kings also claimed to rule by divine right, and they didn't. And the British system, after the Restoration especially, operated on the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy, where the king rules at the discretion of Parliament. King George III was not an absolute monarch. And as for the three branches of government, that had existed in some form for 800 years before the American Revolution. Granted, it evolved over time, it became more clearly defined, but even going back to the first model parliament, you had a concept of separation of powers. And the first model parliament was basically calling in lords and knights and clergy and representatives of the people to act as advisors to the king. But it was understood that the king had limits on his power. And even before Charles I was overthrown and beheaded by Oliver Bloody Cromwell, and the Republic of England was established, which later became the Commonwealth of England, which later went back to being the Kingdom of England, but that's under Charles II of the Restoration. You already had a concept that the king could not raise taxes. Taxes must be raised by the consent of the governed. That's actually a part of British common law that existed before the American colonists complained. That's the basis of their complaint. And you already had the law lords representing a judiciary. It was not an independent Supreme Court at the time. The modern Supreme Court in Britain has existed for 5 minutes, proverbially. But they had a concept of a separate judiciary and a separate court system, independent of the legislature. A two-house legislature that at the time actually functioned as a two-house legislature in full. Now it doesn't. They've crippled the lords, but the king was an executive figure. Now, in the 18th century, the king had a little more power than the modern one does. On paper, it's the same power, but in practice, it's not. But King George III really wasn't this absolute monarch. And he already operated in a system of government that had three branches of government well before America existed. So the idea that the colonists got tired of being ruled by one man who claimed he had divine right from God, who obviously didn't, and who was fiercely tyrannical, and how they understood that the problem was concentrating power in one man, and how they read the Bible and gave us three branches of government. That's all nonsense. But it's the sort of nonsense that makes people feel good when they hear it, and it conflates with their modern views as Americans, especially if they want to believe that America was a special country chosen by God based upon Christian principles. It allows them to read their own ideals into certain biblical passages where they don't belong. In terms of the passage in Isaiah that I just referenced, it actually says, God is our king, God is our judge. God is our lawgiver. It's bizarre that you would think you would get three branches of government when it says God is all three of these things, and you have to remember this is the Old Testament. People back then were unaware of the Trinity, although there are hints of that throughout the Old Testament. All power was concentrated in one being, God. And it's not like Israel operated a republic with a president and three branches of government. The point of the verse in Isaiah is that God is supreme. It isn't trying to tell us anything about how to set up a government. But you see atheists doing the same thing. They like quoting Exodus 21:18 and claiming it proves the Bible is immoral because it says it is morally permissible to beat a slave so long as it takes them a day or two to die. And the reason it's morally permissible to beat the slave is because he's your property. And if I explain to them that that's not what the verse is saying, that it's actually saying that you're not going to fine the person an extra amount because according to the earlier verses that they're not reading, injury that comes to a servant will automatically mean that you must release the servant. So what it's actually talking about is additional penalties. And the part where it says, for he is your money or he is your property in some translations, it's not saying it's morally permissible to beat a slave because he's your property. It is saying if a servant is injured, either accidentally or deliberately, then the servant is released from his contract. If a master were to beat his servant, but the servant recovers, then the master will not have to pay an additional penalty because the loss of revenue he gets that he has to endure from the release of the servant will be the compensation. I know that atheists who hear my explanation will now say I'm using mental gymnastics because that's what they always say. But I'm not. If you actually read Exodus 21, it literally does say that the servant, which is always called slave here, is released if injured. And this is part of that code. You're just taking a single sentence out. It doesn't even talk about morality. This is a law code for ancient Israel. I know that atheists read it as a religious text that's talking about a religion, and in the modern world, religion talks about what morals you personally hold, but isn't about law. But the text in Exodus 21 is not telling you what morals to hold if you follow the Jewish religion. It's telling you the law of Israel. And it doesn't really matter that the atheist will respond with, "You're using mental gymnastics minus the plain reading of the text." The atheist never gives you the plain reading of the text. The atheist is the one who is engaged in motivated reasoning. The idea that I'm emotional and that I have cognitive biases thinking the Bible is the perfect word of God, and when shown evil verses like Exodus 21:18 about how it's morally permissible to beat slaves because they're your property, it causes me to suffer cognitive dissonance and I have to use mental gymnastics to get out of it. That's just nonsense. What I'm saying is actually what the text says. I'm not using mental gymnastics. The atheist community has their own cognitive biases where not only does God not exist and we live in a material universe, not a supernatural one, but God is pure evil and we should hate him, and even if he existed, he's unworthy of our worship. It's the same cognitive biases that the people who run Gaggle and who now run countries like Canada and the UK have started silencing liberty of word. which is why I sometimes have to like a cartoon character when doing these videos. It helps avoid certain problems. I really don't like doing it this way, by the way. This isn't my normal way of speaking about these topics. I always intended to actually, even during my exile, I would load videos on Ramble and I spoke more normally then. My original plan was to make videos for both the Tube of You and Ramble, where I would talk this way on the Tube of You and I would speak more normally on Ramble, but I often didn't have time to make two videos, so I would just play to the lowest common denominator and make Tube of You videos, and that would end up on Ramble. But the point being made is this: I don't talk this way normally, and if you go to my Ramble channel, you'll hear more normal speech. But therein lies the point. The atheist community is motivated by its emotions. It's not motivated by reason. The atheist community likes seeing itself as being more highly evolved, viewing religious people as the primitive cavemen who hold back society and themselves as the ones embracing science that will lead us to the stars. They're on this higher plane above us, seeing the world as it really is through reason and science and evidence. And religious people, of course, refuse to accept that because it requires a certain amount of bravery and strength to live in the real world and to see things as they really are. Whereas religion allows you this comfortable safety blanket where you don't have to see the harsh realities of the world. And people like me, we're just after our own emotional validation. But it can feel very warm and comfortable knowing that you're the superior being who is trying, often failing, but trying to get those lesser than you, those primitive caveman religious people, to see the light of reason, to stand above them from your Olympian heights, calling them upward, realizing few will come, but those who do shall share the enlightenment you have to offer them, and knowing you have risen above the primitive savagery of religion. That can feel very good, can't it? There's a certain emotional angle to the atheist community that they don't admit to. And telling me that I have these emotions, that I'm only seeking emotional validation, that's ridiculous. Why would I seek emotional validation? I know that may sound like an odd question since there's an obvious answer, but the answer isn't as obvious as you would think. You're either going to have to answer it by thinking that all religious people are the same, here's what religious people are like, and applying that to me without any evidence whatsoever that this actually applies to me as an individual. Because you don't see me as an individual, you see me as a typical religious person. Or else you'll have to have something about me personally. And this person didn't take the time to get to know me personally. I, of course, didn't need to take the time to get to know them personally. They're just quoting the same dogmas of the holy religion of atheism. And you could say, well, what about them doing the same thing? They pointed out that you were using bog standard apologetics. But the person I was speaking to never once showed an actual logical fallacy I committed or discussed what I said at all. They just claimed that I was using logical fallacies like special pleading. They didn't actually elaborate on that. They just accused me of it. Because I'm a religious person, and that's what we religious people are like. I was using bog standard apologetics that are obviously debunked and based on logical fallacies, because I'm religious. And the atheist, of course, is simply pointing this out because the atheist is a free thinker who's thinking logically and examining what I said because they're an atheist. It just never occurs to them that they could be wrong, or that the groupthink indoctrination that they're part of could actually poison their minds. After all, they're not part of groupthink. They're atheists. They just lack belief in a God with insufficient evidence as an individual. There's this blindness to it. And nowhere near was this blindness more obvious than in the criticism of me being an egotist. Because one of the points that was brought up, that I brought up, was that I had actually been deplatformed. Granted, mine was actually the lowest level of penalty that the two of you gave. I was locked out of my Gaggle account for 7 months. And I only got back onto my Gaggle account after Gaggle had admitted to the United States government, to the House Judiciary Committee, that at the behest of the Biden administration, they had begun censoring conservatives. After that, they began allowing people to come back onto the tube of you. Dave Cullen, for instance, had an old channel, Computing Forever, that was locked for 5 years, and he was finally allowed back on. I actually wasn't banned for anywhere near as long as Dave Cullen or several others. Now, keep in mind, Dave Cullen did open another channel, the Dave Cullen channel, but his original channel, Computing Forever, was locked for 5 years. And mine was too. I actually knew that this could happen because I saw it happen to other people, so I loaded several videos, which are usually just permutations of videos I had already loaded, like Genesis chapter 1 at the beginning of every month, until November and December when it's Genesis chapter 2. But and it's Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 from the Bishop's Bible. I loaded several videos to make sure my channel stayed active for at least in some way. And I wanted to get it up to 3 years, but I was locked out of my account before I got that many videos loaded. Which turned out to not be such a great tragedy because I was allowed back onto my channel before the year expired, so I'm able to put new content on. But having said that, I was locked out of my channel. And the only videos you could see on my channel after I was locked out were videos that I had pre-scheduled. They didn't do anything but lock me out of my account, so the scheduled videos still went up, even after I couldn't load new videos and I couldn't post new comments. And I pointed this out. And my dear atheist visitor, who came to educate me as to how logically fallacious my thinking is and how deeply emotional I am and how much of an egotist I am, pointed out that I was being an egotist. You see, the first thing I brought up in the post in reply to them, I had to break, my reply was very long, so I broke it into 2 parts. And the first thing I addressed was my deplatforming. Because this person actually pointed out that I was not being censored. That this was actually part of my persecution complex. That that Gaggle wasn't doing anything to stop my liberty of word. Given that it was only about a month and a half to 2 months ago when I got back on to Gaggle, I decided to open on that. Especially since it's been in international news that Gaggle admitted it was doing this and had started reinstating channels. I had ample evidence that this had happened. Perhaps not personally to me. I would have to show my personal information, and I'm not really comfortable doing that. But I had plenty of information out there to show that my claim was at least plausible. And after writing a reply, talking about how I had in fact been locked out of my channel, and that Gaggle had in fact entered certain channels, and that I have to be more careful than I would have been otherwise, because of the way that it works. You're usually not actually targeted by a human. It's usually an intelligent synthetica. And in a weird way, smaller channels are more easily targeted than larger channels because of the calculus involved. The larger the channel is, the more obvious it would be that they were doing this, and they didn't want it to be too obvious. What's more, the larger channels brought in more revenue. I mean, my channel doesn't bring in any revenue. It's a very small channel. I do it for a hobby. But I pointed all this out. I pointed out how I literally wasn't allowed to post new videos. I couldn't post new comments. I couldn't log into my account. And said Atheist kindly pointed out how this shows that it's about my ego, because I ignored everything else he said and focused only on the part that bruised my ego. And of course, what I'm saying is wrong. I'm not being censored. No. You see, the real problem is that my videos just aren't very good. And that's why I get low viewership and low engagement. So you see, it's all my fault. My videos don't get many views, and I get low engagement because my videos aren't good. That's all it is to it. But my ego can't take this, and I just have this constructed fantasy of being answered. And when this person points this out, my ego gets bruised, and that's the only thing I focused on. The only problem with this is that it wasn't the only thing I focused on. I actually made 2 posts. It was going to be 1 post, but I decided to cut it up because it was too long. And I wasn't complaining. About low engagement. And low viewership. My channel has always had low engagement and low viewership. I've made comments in my own videos talking about how poor the quality is. And the quality has actually gone down some because I have financial troubles. My computer crashed, and I've actually had 3 or 4 crashes, getting some used ones. And the audio equipment that's built into this netbook just isn't good. But it didn't matter. Because I didn't intend the Tube of You to be a career for me. It's just something I do as a hobby. And the only major project that I had on this channel was the Bishop's Bible, which is a labor of love. It's a passion project. Almost every major Bible translation other than the Bishop's Bible have an audio version of it. And I want to be the first to do the Bishop's Bible. And I am. I haven't completed the Bishop's Bible, but I am the first to start doing an audio version of it. So even if someone else comes along and beats me to the completed product, I will still at least get to claim that I was the first to start doing so. And maybe I'll be the first to complete it. Who knows? But even that shows you how unserious this claim of egotism is with me, because I honestly didn't expect an audio version of the Bishop's Bible of 1568 to be particularly popular. The Bishop's Bible itself was not popular when it was released and has not grown popularity since then. And then there's the fact that I decided to pair it with cutout animation from Crazy Talk Animator 1. It's fairly obvious that my animation is terrible. Not that it matters, it usually has nothing to do with the actual biblical text. I really only have the animated accompaniment so that I'll have a video to load, rather than it just being an audio file. Because when I started this project, the Tube of You, at least I don't think it allowed just audio files to be loaded. It does now, but it didn't back then. And it adds a little extra something. You do have something to watch, but it's not really relevant, and it's mostly about just the reading. And you have to understand that I'm also trying to capture actual pronunciations in the time. That's why there's a lot of French-style pronunciations, like how ordinance would be ordonnance. It's actually spelled that way in the text. And some archaic words like shall be instead of shall be. Most people don't want to hear that, and the people who do would probably be historians who probably wouldn't read the whole thing. I already know that. I want to one day do the Bishop's Bible again in a more modern speech, but right now I'm not. But that's the whole point. The Bishop's Bible project, my biggest, most ambitious project that I put on the Tube of You, was one that I already knew would not be very successful. Because even people who might appreciate it for its historical nature are probably not going to look at every video. And most people who want to listen to an audio Bible aren't going to pick the 1568 Bishop's Bible, even if I read it in purely modern pronunciations with revisions to bring it up to modern spelling and pronunciation standards, which I'm not doing. So no, this isn't about viewership. There's also the fact that for a 5-year period, I didn't post any new videos. And the reason I didn't post new videos for 5 years was because my house burned down. That's one of the reasons I'm in financial difficulties today. When I got back on the Tube of You, it was not really that easy at that point to gain traction because they were already shadow banning some people and artificially boosting left-wing progressive voices to help Kamala Harris win or to prop up the Biden administration or to go after Trump. And while I don't really run a political channel, most people, and probably Al Gore and his rhythm, see me as right-wing and as conservative and what have you. But it didn't really matter, because there are ways you can boost your channel. In fact, I found one. I mimicked an atheist video. Now, I inverted it so it was a criticism of atheism. I did a few experiments doing that, and I finally found the sweet spot. At least the sweet spot as it was back then. I think Al Gore and his rhythm have been rejiggered since then. But I got over 2,000 views. Al Gore and his rhythm enhanced me. And all I had to do was talk like an angry militant atheist, only turning my ire to militant atheism instead of to Christianity. I don't like making videos like that, but it was to prove a point. So, I mean, there are things I could do to gain a boost on this channel that I just don't do. And yet it's my ego, because I just don't like the fact that I get low engagement and low views. Oh, come on. It wasn't about me getting low engagement and low views. It was about me not being able to load new videos, not being able to post comments, It was about being censored. When I said I was locked out of my account, I didn't mean I was getting low views and low engagement. I meant I could not post new content at all. And this person denied that happened to me. This person straight up tried to gaslight me into thinking that what I had put up with for 7 months didn't happen to me at all. But it did happen to me. I even had evidence. I showed them the House Judiciary Committee's what they said about it, and the person said that that was a partisan press release. On the House Judiciary website, by the way, that I quoted from, they also host the letter from Gaggle admitting what they did. There are several news sources, both right-wing and left-wing. There's MSN, Fox, MS Now, which used to be MSNBC and might still be. I don't know when they're changing their name exactly. CBS, ABC, NBC, the Associated Press, they all covered this story. Everyone covered this story. And yet this atheist is denying it happened and telling me I'm not really being answered, that I was just making content that's bad and didn't get engagement. It's bad enough I have to talk this way. It kind of hurts my voice after a while, and I make long-form content, and I'm not using filters or anything, and I usually don't stop the video unless I make a mistake or have to do something. So talking this way kind of makes my voice hoarse, and I don't really like doing it. I do it specifically to avoid a problem that I know exists. And this person just told me it didn't happen. The rational, logical atheist basing everything on reason and evidence is telling me what happened to me didn't happen, and the only reason I think it did is because I have emotional problems. Am I supposed to take that seriously? The simple reality is that atheists are not rational people these days. The anti-religion atheist that goes on how religion is all the time and how logically fallacious it is, they don't listen. They don't really know what they're talking about. They've never read the Bible. Even if they've said they've read it multiple times and know it better than Christians, they haven't read it. They certainly didn't become atheists by reading the Bible. All they do is quote what other atheists say. I know, because even after I made that video last week, because of my legal problems that I had to take care of, they weren't serious. They just a little bit of time consuming, enough that I wasn't able to make a new video. But when you think about it, after this person had invaded my channel and spoke to me, to put me down on my own channel, I saw another atheist that I was talking to, and we were talking about how evil God was, the sacrifice of Isaac, how much of a monster God was to tell Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. The atheists always kind of ignore the fact that he told him not to, and if you bring it up, it's, yeah, but he still told him to. What kind of monster is that? And my explanation is one you don't really hear many Christians these days use, but it is historically accurate. And that is that human sacrifice was actually absurdly common in the ancient world. And the real meaning to the story of Abraham and Isaac, the meaning that would have been understood by ancient Israel, is that God does not want human sacrifice. The entire point of this story, from their point of view, would be a denial of human sacrifice. That God supplied himself a sacrifice. He had an angel stop the hand of Abraham. The story illustrates that God is putting an end to this practice. to allow his sacred line to flourish. And it also points to Christ, because Christ is being substituted for Isaac in much the lamb is being substituted for Isaac in much the same way that Christ is to be substituted for us. And of course he brought up that and said, oh, but that doesn't make any sense either. And then he brought the usual Matt Dillahunty garbage, where it's God sacrificed himself to ... satisfy himself? And it's the usual God sacrificed himself to appease himself garbage that we've heard other atheists repeat. And at that point, you know that atheists don't really try to understand what Christians are actually saying. The sacrifice of Jesus, by the way, was never about God needing to sacrifice Jesus to satisfy himself. Jesus wasn't sacrificed for God. Jesus was sacrificed for man. The idea that God wanted to forgive man, but he was unable to, so he sent Jesus down and Jesus got executed, and that was the sacrifice, and that sacrifice allowed God to be satisfied and allowed God to be able to forgive us, and the whole point is getting God satisfied. That's idiotic nonsense that you hear from atheists. That just isn't the point. The real point, of course, for Jesus being sacrificed on the cross was that he paid a ransom for many. This is actually stated in the text of the Bible, by the way. Look it up. Look up the phrase, ransomed sacrifice for many in a search engine. You will find these verses. They're in the Bible. Jesus died on the cross for man. Jesus' death on the cross was a ransom paid for man to Satan. Jesus' death on the cross was also a way for us to take out our anger, our hatred, and our rejection of God on God, and to hold God up to our mockery, our ridicule, our scorn, our hatred. And at the same time, pouring all of that hatred into him, an outside object, to bring about a catharsis. Because we know he didn't really do all these horrible things. We're just accusing him of it because we don't want to admit that we are the problem. So we placed all of our faults onto him. And yet we see him standing there or hanging suspended from his cross. Broken, bloodied, defeated by us. It was about recognition that we did this. It was like getting it out of our system, about holding him up so we could see that happen and realize it need not happen, and that he need not have done this and chose to show us what we were. And another thing that atheists always ignore is that it's not just Jesus dying on the cross, but also the resurrection. Because by the resurrection of Christ, our evil deed of killing an innocent man for our own faults is inverted. For no longer is Christ defeated in the grave, but he has risen to new life. And no longer is our evil deed the extinguishing of an innocent life, but it is turned into our triumph. For by our evil acts, this ultimate good was accomplished. For Christ did not simply return to life. He conquered death. And he overcame death. We will not have to die in Christ Jesus. That is the meaning of the sacrifice of Jesus. Jesus' death on the cross was not about satisfying God and giving God the ability to forgive us. It was about allowing us to receive God. And it was about paying the ransom to Satan. So whenever an atheist talks about how it doesn't make sense about Jesus dying on the cross because it's God satisfying himself, that's gibberish. That's just nonsense that atheists spew. And it proves the point that I'm making in this video. You see, all of these arguments that you hear atheists repeat because they heard other atheists say them are shallow, and they don't actually address what Christians actually believe. This is why atheists think you can debunk the first cause argument by invoking the multiverse with many universes in it and saying maybe our universe was caused by two universes colliding or something along those lines. One of the atheists I spoke to in the previous video, when someone else said that as an atheist you would have no objective basis for morality, responded by saying, well, I don't know why God would be the objective basis for morality. And I responded to that by pointing out that God is the objective standard for morality because God is the objective standard for existence. That, as Paul Tillich said, God is the ground of being from which everything else came. And that God, as creator of the universe, ultimately established the laws of nature from which we would derive any morals from, because morality is nothing more than behaving in accordance to the laws of nature that would allow us to live the life that we are supposed to live. Violations of moral laws lead to adverse consequences, regardless of whether or not human law recognizes them or human moral codes do. They will always lead to adverse consequences. And these consequences are part of how the universe itself works, how the machinery of creation functions. So that even if God doesn't come down and zap you with a proverbial lightning bolt, you will face these consequences as a result of the nature of your act. But the nature of your act itself is dependent upon natural laws on which the universe was created, and God created those natural laws. As a result, morality was created by God. God is the objective standard for morality because God is the objective standard for natural law and all that exists. And he responded to that rather long argument by reducing it to me saying, God has the right to make all the moral rules we live by because he created the universe. As if I was just saying that God has the right to do something because he did something else. And he posited this hypothetical, well, if I created a universe, would I be the objective moral standard for that universe? And he, of course, followed up by saying that he bet that I would say no. That even though my argument is that God is the objective standard of morality for this universe because God created this universe, if this atheist created a universe, he would not be the objective standard. And he pointed out how my answer will be special pleading. Because I say that God has the right to make our moral rules because he created our universe, but if an atheist created a universe, he wouldn't have that same right that God has. I'm going to have to rely on special pleading. He knew in advance not only that I would have a logical fallacy, but which logical fallacy it would be. I would engage in the special pleading fallacy. The problem is that his argument missed the entire point that I was making. You see, when we speak about God creating the universe, we're not talking about God creating a universe, as in one universe in a multiverse of many universes, some of which were not created by God. Perhaps none of them were created by God but ours. When you're making a first cause argument, either the actual first cause argument or one contingent on first cause, you're using the standard philosophical definitions that existed within classical philosophy. Which means when you speak about the universe, you're not talking about one universe in a multiverse of many universes. I even told him that. I told him that if the multiverse with many universes in it exists, then the multiverse would be the universe, and all the universes in the multiverse would just be smaller divisions within the universe. They wouldn't actually be separate universes, because the term universe means everything. That's the entire point of the argument. He then accused me of another logical fallacy, the argument ad dictionarium fallacy. In this argument, he said that I'm committing a logical fallacy by insisting a word has only one accepted definition when it has others, and I should accept other definitions. The problem with this, though, is that if I don't engage in the argument ad dictionarium fallacy, where I say there's only one definition when there's really others, then this allows the atheist to fundamentally change the nature of what it is that I'm actually arguing by simply applying a different definition of the words that I'm using. So you basically have to commit the argument ad dictionarium logical fallacy to make any argument, because otherwise anyone can come along and just use a different definition of the word and change an argument you're using. Of course, the argument ad dictionarium fallacy is not really committed when you simply explain what you meant by the words you used. In fact, it's actually the other way around. The atheist was committing the argument ad dictionarium fallacy, because the actual fallacy is not committed when you insist that only one definition is acceptable. It exists when you apply a false definition to someone else's statement, which is what he was doing. Because think about it. If I accept that in my argument, the word universe only refers to our one universe, but it doesn't apply to other universes or to the multiverse of many universes, then my argument is no longer that God is the source of all existence. My argument is that God is the source of our universe, and only our universe, but not the other universes. And that this atheist can also create a universe, and therefore I have to either admit that he would be the objective moral standard of the universe he creates, just like God is the ultimate moral standard of ours, because he has a right to set the moral rules because he created it, or else I'll have to engage in the special pleading fallacy. But it missed the entire point. I actually told him he can't create a universe because the entire point that I'm making is the universe is everything. But even accepting his definition, it doesn't make sense, because even if he creates a universe, he himself is a limited contingent being who cannot transcend the laws of nature from which he himself exists within. So any universe he creates will be contingent not just on him creating it, but on his parents, his grandparents, his great-grandparents, and the whole host of humanity, and any species that humanity evolved from back to the original life form, which itself will be contingent on the laws of physics that ultimately gave rise to the conditions on which life could even be predicated. So him creating a universe is ultimately everything leading up to him creating the universe. And it is still him working within our universe with our laws of physics to create a new universe, which, of course, would also, by definition, need to be contingent on, if not ultimately sharing, the same laws of physics we use. The fact that he is a contingent being means that he cannot be the source of existence. And even though my argument, fine, when I said universe, I only meant our one universe. But the argument I was making was not just that God created our one universe, but he created all the other universes in the multiverse. And if there's something bigger than the multiverse, a gagaverse, which is a giant thing with multiple multiverses in it, then God created that too. My point wasn't that God has the right to make our moral rules because he created us. My point was that anything you could point to from which you could base morality on is ultimately contingent on God. Because God didn't just create this one universe and not the other universes in the multiverse. God is the source of existence. that nothing else existed until God created it, and that God decided how the laws of nature would work. He then, of course, responded with the usual atheist trope of how religious people are confused and they don't really understand that the laws of nature aren't normal laws like what you would see a government pass. And they brought up how rocks, when they fall because of gravity, not because God wrote a law and they're obeying that law. He actually thought that I believed, when I used the term natural law, or the laws of nature, that I thought God sat down behind a proverbial desk and wrote a bunch of rules, and that a bunch of inanimate objects in the universe obey God because they don't want to be criminals. Because when I think about the laws of nature, I think they're literal, actual laws, and the reason I think that is because I'm a religious person, we're stupid, and we think the laws of nature are actual laws. I've actually seen other atheists say that is what religious people think, and it's not. No one thinks that. But it's a typical thing you see from followers of the holy religion of atheism. You know, that religion that says, I'm not religious, I just lack belief in a God due to insufficient evidence, but then says garbage like this. And that's actually the point. Atheists do not listen to what it is you're actually saying, and they're not responding to the actual arguments. And the reason they're not listening is because they already know religion is garbage, and all arguments apologists use are rooted in logical fallacies, and all I have to do is identify the fallacy and it'll debunk them. And I, the atheist who believes in materialism and right, we live in a materialist universe. We're purely naturalistic. There's nothing supernatural. There are no gods. I don't have to prove anything, though. You're just basing everything on logical fallacies. And because they think of themselves as the rationalists who understand reality, and they know how religious people engage in logical fallacies, and they can just identify the fallacy and debunk them. Because they think that way, they don't actually know what they're talking about. But you can't convince them they don't know what they're talking about because they've blinded themselves to how stupid and irrational they are. And I don't really need to be told that I'm some sort of emotional cripple because of that. And yes, I know I sound somewhat unhinged in these videos, but again, I will remind you, I'm doing that to sidestep Intelligence Synthetica, and if you go to my new channel, I'm hoping that I can make normal-sounding videos. But this video is unusually long already, so I shall take my leave of you. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.